Welcome, friends. We're so excited that you're here on a snowy Wednesday at noon at the Kennedy Center. This is the best place to be Wednesdays at noon anywhere on BYU campus, and we're grateful that you joined us here. My name is Quinn Meekum. I'm the academic director here at the Kennedy Center, and we're pleased to welcome you to the first lecture in our winter semester lecture series on the theme Authoritarianism and Its Discontents. We are pleased to welcome today Professor Safa Al-Saeedi, who is joining us from Marist College, and she will be speaking on the topic of monarchy, media, and the politics of reform in Saudi Arabia. Before we get to our lecture, I do have a number of announcements. We've got some great things coming up that you may want to consider if it fits your interests. Tomorrow, you'll notice from the flyer on your seat that we do have a study abroad fair for 2024. That will take place between 11 a.m. and 2 p.m. in the Wilkinson Center Garden Court. Tomorrow, please consider going to that if you're still looking for a program that you'd like to attend this year. Also, tomorrow at 11 a.m. In this room, we are in the process of hiring a new director for the BYU London Center, a resident director, and one of the candidates for that position will be providing a demonstration of teaching on something related to the UK, and we would love to have students attend, and we have an incentive system for you, which is empanadas. So when you're looking for, about 11 a.m. tomorrow and you're wondering, man, I'm hungry, what am I going to do for lunch? Well, the answer is you come here and you get an empanada. Timothy Farrant is the candidate that will be presenting tomorrow, and he's presenting on the topic London and the Religious Other, England's Jews. Likewise, tomorrow in this room at noon, if you would like to stay, we have a GWS, Global Women's Studies talk, Developing Corporate Social Advocacy Through the Lens of Female Refugees. Friday in this room at 11 a.m., the Ambassador of Iceland will be here. Her Excellency Bergis Ellertsdottir is the first woman ambassador from Iceland to the United States, and she'll be here speaking to us on some of the concerns of Iceland and the way that those concerns may also affect the United States. And then finally, next week at this time, in this place, our second lecture in our series will be by Professor Tony Ketty, who is a professor of ancient Near Eastern studies at the University of Texas at Austin. And he is speaking on the topic Roman imperialism and its apocalyptic discontents in ancient Judea. And we invite you to come back and join us again next Wednesday for Tony Ketty's talk. Before I introduce our speaker, we would like to have an opening prayer today, and Miley Dono from Denver, Colorado, major in political science, will offer that. Miley, can you come on up?
Dear Heavenly Father, for this day, we're thankful that we could all come and listen to Professor Al-Saeedi talk about the politics and reform in Saudi Arabia. Please help that we'll all be able to learn something new and that we can discuss and talk about it, and that we'll all be able to return to our homes safely after this night of these name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
I just also want to mention, for those of you looking a little further down the line, that on February 21st, we will have a book discussion in here on the Kennedy Center's featured title for the semester associated with our theme. We will be reading, for those of you enrolled in the course here, and those of you who are interested in reading the book in advance of February 21st, we will be reading this book by Anne Applebaum. She's a writer at The Atlantic, Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism. And that's our featured title for the semester. We encourage you, if you are interested in reading that book, to pick up a copy of it. We do have copies available to you at the Kennedy Center main office at the front desk there. All right. Well, I'm really delighted to introduce you to Professor Safa Al-Saeedi. Professor Al-Saeedi is originally from Yemen, where her family still lives. For those of you that understand the politics of the Middle East a little bit, her family lives in Houthi-controlled territory in Yemen right now, and she was expressing to me that because of the marvels of the modern internet, she's able to understand and connect with her family on a regular basis there. She graduated with her Ph.D. From Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. She's also been a postdoctoral associate at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a predoctoral fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. She will be speaking to us today about the way in which media affects balance of power and the way in which transitions to new forms of media might shift the way that different political elites have the ability to influence policy over time. I don't know how many of you remember the cassette tape, but I am old enough to have made many playlist mixtape on cassette as a young person, and for a long time, cassette tapes have been the way in which popular religious figures and others have been able to influence and populations and to get their messages out. As you may realize, the cassette tapes are no longer the main mode of media transmission. And so we're in this remarkable period, not only of change in Saudi Arabia, but also in change in the media landscape and the way in which you can call your mom on Zoom in northern Yemen, right? Even while it's in the midst of a civil war, it's really transformed the way in which we think about who has access to information. So we're really excited to explore that topic today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Al-Saeedi.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for the very kind introduction. And this is not my first time in Utah. I have been in Utah several times. I have enjoyed it very much. Oh, okay. Can you hear me? Or I can project. Okay. I was saying this is not my first time in Utah. I have been in Utah several times, and I have enjoyed it very much. And I discovered that you actually have some of the best Middle Eastern food in the U.S. And I have been here for 15 years, and I have tried so many restaurants. So something great. Anyway, as was mentioned, I focus on media and authoritarian context, and today I will be speaking about Saudi Arabia. How many of you are following the news about Saudi Arabia these days? Okay, good. So you have some background. So to start, if you read about Saudi Arabia for the last several decades in journalistic and academic writings, you will hear things about Saudi Arabia as being the protector of traditional Islam. You also hear about restrictions on women's rights and the religious or morality police and ban of entertainment. That's for the last several decades. However, if you read the news about Saudi Arabia today, or more recently, you see a different picture to some degree. You see a government or a society that's trying to distance itself from these former associations. They lifted the ban on, public entertainment. Saudi Arabia today now hosts the largest concerts in the Middle East. So if you go to the Middle East and want to experience fun concerts, that's the destination today. And they lifted the ban on women driving, and they're trying to expand women's role in the workforce. So these changes, presenting a puzzle. What explains this change? Is Saudi Arabia really liberalizing? And if it is, what is the scope of this liberalization? Okay? Now, There are several explanations provided by observers of the kingdom. One of these explanations has to do with international pressure. Some believe that Saudi Arabia is liberalizing because, Saudi allies, such as the US, are actually pressuring it to change, especially after the 9/11 attacks, because 15 out of the 19 hijackers were Saudi nationals. Okay? However, international pressure as an explanation is not sufficient or does not explain it entirely. Why? Because Saudi Arabia has been changing in areas that have little to do with international concerns, such as anti-corruption laws and economic diversification. The second limitation of the international pressure argument is that it doesn't take into account what's happening inside Saudi Arabia. Okay? So that is the first explanation. The second explanation has to do with leadership change. Some believe that these changes have been due to the rise of de facto leader Mohammed bin Salman as a reformer. However, if you study the politics of the kingdom for the last several decades, you'll notice that actually some of these changes have been underway for a while. They simply just made it to the news only recently. They started under his uncle, Crown Prince, and later King Abdullah. So the leadership change as an argument is a factor, but again, it does not explain the entire trend or change over an extended period of time. The third explanation has to do with oil. Some believe, because of the petroeconomy in Saudi Arabia, that these liberalizing reforms are happening due to rising oil prices. The oil prices argument is that when the state of Saudi Arabia has high oil returns, it actually has sufficient funds that it can buy out public support without relying on religious legitimacy or the support of the conservatives. But if we look at oil prices over time, we see that they have fluctuated significantly. And actually, during the 80s and the 90s, when Saudi Arabia was viewed as most conservatives, it was a period with high oil prices too. So if high oil prices explain this liberalizing reforms, why did they not happen during that time period? So the oil price argument, again, is limited. So what explains change then? I find the answer to this question at least partly elsewhere. I focus on the domestic politics of the kingdom. I see these liberalizing reforms as a result of a shift in the balance of power of ideological elites in the kingdom. And by ideological elites, I am talking about important and influential social and political figures who really play a big role in influencing public opinion in Saudi Arabia, and they're differentiated ideologically as several constellations falling under broadly liberal and conservative. This change, or in the balance of power among these elites, begins in the public discourse and ends in the policy sphere, mediated through a process of media contestation, public opinion change, and mobilization. Now, what do I mean by this? So, in the time period between the 1980 and the 2000s, Saudi Arabia, the main dominant ideological force in Saudi Arabia were the conservatives. However, in the time period between the 2000s through today, the ideological voices, the liberal voices, have been the most dominant in the kingdom. Now, what is the key determinant of who is the loudest voice in the kingdom is actually the media infrastructure in Saudi Arabia. And to explain this, let me show you how how the media landscape in Saudi Arabia has changed significantly over time. So the media landscape in Saudi Arabia has changed significantly over time, due specifically to the internet. And let me now contrast to you how the Saudi media landscape was before the internet and after the internet. So the Saudi media landscape before the internet consisted of two media spheres. the state media sphere and the counter media sphere. The state media sphere consisted of media platforms that the state highly controlled and restricted, such as the print, television, and radio. The counter media sphere consisted of media platforms that were difficult for the state to track and censor, such as pamphlets, leaflets, and the cassette tape. Okay, and I find that the state, and I find this by looking actually at regulations in the kingdom that determined who could access and not access these platforms. And I also look at the existing media platforms, who owned them, and I found them again controlled by the state, except for, of course, for media platforms outside of the media sphere, and they were specifically the cassette tape. Now, how many of you are familiar with the cassette tape? Okay, a lot of people are familiar with the cassette tape. So the cassette tape, as already some of you are familiar, is basically a small device that stores sounds. It was invented in the 60s, and its use continued through the 2000s. So the cassette tape, because it was very difficult for the state to track it, and it was, circulated in a decentralized fashion, it presented a prospective platform to ideological actors who were denied media access. Among these actors in Saudi Arabia, conservatives were the best well-positioned to control the cassette tape for two reasons. The first reason is cultural. Adopting a religious worldview, conservatives often expressed their views in what? In sermons. And sermons as an auditory expression meshed well with the cassette tape as an audio device. So on the one hand, it was the convenience of the tape for the medium of expression of conservative, which was sermon. The second advantage that conservatives had was the religious infrastructure, because again, they expressed their views in sermons. These cassette tapes were actually circulated in mosques and religious centers. Both advantages really allowed conservatives to deploy the cassette tape as a medium outside of the state control in a way that other ideological contenders could not. Because why? They relied on written expression. And written expression was far easier for the state to control. And I find this by actually talking to former tape distributors and producers who tell me that the only rival to what they produce was the music industry, was not another ideological content. And I also look at digital archives of the content that was circulated through the tape, and it was mostly religious content, ideological content of constellations falling under the conservatives. Okay? Okay. Now I have shown you the media landscape in Saudi Arabia before the internet. Let me show you the Saudi media landscape after the internet. So after the internet, the state still very much controls the media platforms it controlled before the internet. But when the internet entered Saudi Arabia, it supplied a host of media platforms with different, expression forms, including written expression, accommodating written expressions by other ideological contenders on the one hand. On the other hand, the internet completely displaced the cassette tape. So if we look at the most followed political actors in the Saudi Twitter, we will see that today most of them are the social liberals, reformists, and political activists, and they're all falling under the the liberal elite constellation, while conservatives, who were before the internet the dominant force, if we look at the 1,000 most followed account in Saudi Arabia, they're actually no longer the most dominant. On the other hand, like I said, the internet completely displaced the cassette tape. The internet, within a few years, that cassette tape was eclipsed. Some distributors told me actually in some areas it happened within 4 months, where they were actually distributing tapes in millions, and within several years, Now the cassette tape is no longer in use. Now what is the significance of this? The significance of this is that on the one hand, the internet enhanced the media leverage of ideological actors who before the internet had no media presence, no sustained media presence. On the other hand, the internet undermined the media leverage of conservatives who before the internet were the only dominant ideological force outside of the state with media access. And what I'm trying to highlight here that when we study media contestation in these authoritarian regimes, it's important to pay attention not only to media access, but also to media leverage. That yes, today conservatives and liberals, they both have access to the internet, but the internet expanded the media access of conservatives too, but denied them the media exclusivity they had before the internet. Hence, before the internet, they were the most dominant ideological force, while after the internet, now they have a competition. They have contenders. Now, what does this have to do with the puzzle I'm trying to explain today? The implication of this is that the implication of this is that when ideological forces in the kingdom, the liberal forces, became louder, they were able to also shape public opinion in a way that was unprecedented before the internet. While before the internet, conservatives were actually who dominated the ideological and landscape. And I see this by looking at a subset of royal decrees in Saudi Arabia before and after the internet that are salient to ideological conflict in the kingdom. And what I find is that before the internet, subset of these decrees, they appealed to the specific demands on conservatives, when they were dominant through the cassette tape. Today, however, I see the reverse. I see a subset of that decree that is relevant to ideological conflict in the kingdom now being more appealing and advantaging the demands of liberals. And this is just an example of an issue area of religion. We see how before the internet, more decrees were in favor of conservatives' preferences and demands, while after, what happened? Okay, so while after the internet, it's ahead of me now. I did not do this. Okay, so as you can see from this slide, before the internet, more royal decrees were in favor of conservatives, while after the internet, now we see more royal decrees are in favor of social reformists and political activists. And there is, of course, a causal chain that links how these royal decrees actually reflect the demands of these ideological actors, because I look at petitions, they're public petitions that express demands in the public, and I see how there is a direct response to these specific demands. Now, you probably, when you read the news, you have heard about the lifting the ban on women driving, and also ending the role of religious police in Saudi Arabia. Now, to many of you, or to those who probably are not familiar with the domestic politics in the kingdom, they probably would think that they are sudden, top down, that it's the state, which to some degree it's true. But actually these changes, and these are just two examples, they were preceded by many years of mobilizations, many years of campaigning, many years of activism. And those actually who advocated for these demands are behind bars. However, the demands themselves, they were addressed. Now, some of you might wonder, understandably so, that isn't Saudi Arabia an absolute monarchy? Should we really expect Saudi Arabia to be responsive to its citizens? And to answer that question, let me mention a few points. Most of these reforms are largely social and economic in nature. they're not political. Meaning, when the state make concessions and compromises and response to the citizens, it's actually not threatening its direct political power. So these are in areas that do not directly affect the stability of the state. So that's one. The second thing is that when these regimes, when sometimes they make concessions, they address the demands of their citizens, sometimes it's as part of maintaining their durability and cultivating their legitimacy in certain areas, especially in areas they think that's not going to affect them directly on the political level. The third, yeah, Saudi Arabia, of course, have between time to time employed repression as a strategy, because we know from research and also from learning about Saudi Arabia that repression is costly, but also it's not always effective. So the state has also to use other strategies to maintain power domestically. Now, what can we learn about this beyond Saudi Arabia? Now, covered now mainly Saudi Arabia. What are the lessons that can one draw from the case of Saudi Arabia beyond it? One lesson is that we pay attention to media contestation and in the peripheries. That yes, Saudi Arabia is a highly censored society, but when we look at contestation within society, we see spheres of profound media contestation. So that is the first thing. The second thing, that contestation isn't always against the state. Yes, it is against the state, but there's also contestation against other actors within society. In this case, conservatives and liberals in social and economic an area. And third, this argument can apply to contexts that before the internet have state monopoly of the media. It makes us wonder that when the internet came, yes, it was open and accessible, offered open media platforms to all, but at the same time, how did it impact these actors who before the internet were denied media access? What is the relative impact? In the case of Saudi Arabia, we saw how it eclipsed the cassette tape. And yes, it expanded media access of conservatives, but it denied them exclusivity. Yes, they are present online in YouTube and Instagram and social media and everything, but at the same time, they are no longer the loudest ideological force outside of the state. And that's something to keep in mind. And I welcome any questions you might have, and I'm on time. Yes.
Excellent. We now have a good amount of time for discussion today. We always try to have a good Q&A discussion with our speakers. We will go until 1 p.m. If you have questions at that point. Some of you may need to leave for classes before 1, and you're welcome to do that when you need to leave. When you do have a question, we have a microphone that we're going to bring to you. So we just invite you to raise your hand, and Professor Saeedi will call on you. When you wait for the microphone, stand. Tell us a little bit about who you are. Tell us your name. If you're a student, what you're studying here at BYU. And then we invite you to ask your question. And because we just have a little bit of time, I'm going to take the opportunity to ask you the first question, as you all are thinking. So as I listened to your talk, I felt like, as someone who cares about political reform, that the internet sounds like a good thing. That it is shifting the balance of power in a way that makes it so that people who care about reform might be more influential. At the same time, the internet is basically everywhere. I mean, in every country of the world, it's an important presence, more or less. And yet we've seen increasing closure politically, more and more authoritarian closures in the past decade. And so I'm wondering how you might explain the puzzle of more and more internet, but at the same time we're not seeing more and more liberal political reform in the world. We're actually seeing often more authoritarianism, and I'm wondering if there's also a link that the internet creates opportunities for authoritarian governments to track their opponents and to control their opponents in a way that actually makes it easier for them to stay in power. So I'll let you take that question, and then let's open it up to the audience. Again, just raise your hand. We'll bring you the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's an excellent question. Well, it's important to remember that when the internet is basically a platform, is a host of platforms that's open to everyone, including the regimes. And as the internet, becomes more available, these regimes are developing strategies to catch up. So part of the reason that in some contexts, these contexts are becoming more authoritarian with the internet is that these regimes are becoming more and more savvy and keeping up. In the case of Saudi Arabia right now, it's one of the most digitally connected societies in the world. The internet penetration in Saudi Arabia is actually more than the US and Germany. Okay? In Saudi Arabia, if you get a parking ticket, you can't even work, you can't even get married, not use the hospital, nothing. Why? Because everything is linked to your ID through the internet. So yes, there is an ideological change in some area that is pushing the state in some direction, but it's becoming more and more of a police state. So if we disaggregate these societies, we can see these inherent contradictions, and I think it's because these regimes are very pragmatic. They want to stay in power, and hence we see the authoritarians. Now, why do societies vary in how they deploy the internet and, for example, can force liberalization, as in the case of Iran? It really depends to the degree that you're organized and mobilized. It has to do with mobilization dynamics within countries. For example, in Saudi Arabia, the state initially really tried to block the internet, and it failed miserably because a lot of Saudis had already been tapping into the networks of neighboring Bahrain and Dubai. So it really varies. It depends on the case you're looking into, but I think a lot of it is that these regimes are keeping up. They're defeating us.
Hi, yes. I had a question. Do you think that Saudi Arabia's desire to sort of make peace with Israel, is that due to Iran, like trying to find a coalition against Iran? Or do you think it has more to do with local politics and trying to find, like what do the average Saudi Arabians feel about Saudi Arabia's new efforts to sort of make peace with Israel?
That's an excellent. Okay, can you hear me? Okay, that's an excellent question. I think it has to do with three reasons. The first reason, Saudi Arabia is really invested in the 2030 vision to diversify from oil and to become a regional superpower. And Saudi Arabia sees, there's benefit in aligning with the state of Israel, because the state of Israel, of course, is well known, in the region as very economically developed, scientific. Saudi Arabia, so and that's one side. On the other hand, of course, there is the regional, the Cold War, what we call in the Middle East, the proxy war in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia is, of course, concerned about this proxy war in the region, and it sees, when it comes to its regional threat, its security aligns more with the state of Israel as a government. And also, there is an ideological shift on the ground in Saudi Arabia. I follow closely the Saudi social media, and I see, of course, that people are not so happy with the civilian suffering that's happening right now, but at the same time, they still hang, to the two-state solution and peace, because they think that's the only way forward. So I think there is an ideological shift on the domestic level, and that existential regional threat felt from Iran is also thought and experienced through Saudis. It could be part of state propaganda, or it could be, because they also follow the news closely. So it's a three-pronged answer. Yeah, good question.
Hi. This is a multifaceted question, so I apologize. But Saudi Arabia, as we know, is a prominent pivot state with military, economic, and ideologically strategic assets to a lot of great powers around the world. And with this greater liberalization that you've been talking about, especially with the young MBS spearheading this Saudi Vision 2030, what are your thoughts on how the balance of Saudi Arabian domestic socioeconomics What are your thoughts on how that influences the Saudi Vision 2030, as well as the regional and global geopolitical implications? And also, how does this, or I guess, does this put their identity as the custodian of Islam at risk?
Very good question. I think what's happening in Saudi Arabia domestically on the ideological level is in favor of 2030 vision, because when Saudi Arabia was dominated by conservative voices, the role of the religious establishment and the Sahwa movement, Saudi Arabia really tried to enact certain reforms, but they were viewed as in conflict with traditional Islam. Now, with the existence of voices who want to reform Islam, or want a more modern view of Islam, or want a secular state, so Saudi Arabia, of course, is I would say the state is benefiting. The other thing is MBS being a young leader, and 70% of the Saudi population are under the age of 30. So I think, there almost feels like they're behind them. Now, that does not change the fact that it's a police state and a lot of people are behind bars, but I'm talking about the direction. As where the country is going and how that can affect its position globally, a lot of Saudis believe it will benefit them globally, because the 2030 vision wants Saudi Arabia to open to the world, to be a regional superpower, and to rely less on oil, to have a better standing in the world culturally, not just like economically in terms of oil, and politically. So I think it's aligning. But that's not to say it is a leader thing or a vision thing, because this change really started under King Abdullah 20 years ago. So some of it even was before like the 9/11. So some people, so not to think that 9/11 was the impetus. Yeah.
These are great questions. Thank you so much. Just please stand and ask your question and introduce yourself as you can.
Yeah, these are excellent questions.
Hello, my name is Spencer Evans. I'm studying international relations. And I was curious as to those pre-internet schematics that you were showing that kind of showed that it was predominantly conservative voices that were accessing the people outside of state-led media. Do you feel like one of the reasons that now post-internet it's vastly, the vast majority is like social liberal, do you feel that that patterned the shift that the government made, or that it always would have been that way if the internet had existed, regardless of whether or not the government was conservative?
That's a good question. I think a lot of it would be regardless whether the government shift. I think on some level the government realizes that society is changing, and a change needs to be made. So I think it might appear that some of this presence, these are open platforms. These are authentic accounts. They're not like trolls or Twitter bots. They're well-known people. Some of them, they're not necessarily in favor of the regime, such as political activists who are mostly either abroad or. So I would say the pattern would probably hold, but perhaps not be as amplified. Now the state has a vision and everybody is encouraged to talk about it, because the 2030 vision was announced in 2015, while this change started at least 15 years before that. So I think the pattern would still hold, but perhaps not be as clear.
My name is Seneca. I'm studying Middle East Studies and Arabic here. I'm wondering if, like, looking into the future, if you see Saudi Arabia following that trend of increasing, like, use of social media and trying to increase, like, the way that people can share their voice on political matters, or if you see them following more of a Western increase of authoritarian, like, constrictions and limiting people's access to social media.
That's an excellent question. I think both. I think politically, Saudi Arabia is becoming more of a police state on the political front. There's a lot of power consolidation right now, elimination of opponents, more people behind bars than ever. So in the political dimension, I really think it's becoming more of a police state and authoritarianism, and there's no denying that. But I think in other areas, maybe it's way of like balancing. In other areas, it's really changing, and I think it's changing. It affords to make that change because it doesn't necessarily threat its political power. For example, when lifted the ban on women driving, it put all the activists behind bar, but it addressed the demand. And I think the message to Saudi society was, you know, I am doing this not because of the activists, even though it was because of the activists, because there were a lot of protests and a lot of campaigning and a lot of pressure and a lot of like, you know, international shaming. And so I think I think both at the same time. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Rachel, and I'm thinking about international relations, but I'm still kind of new to this stuff, and I just learned today that it sounds like Saudi Arabia still has a monarchy. Mm-hmm. So as internet has become more widespread in the country, how do the people feel as they can see that they're in this monarchy, but there's other like forms of government with democracy, you know, in other parts of the world? How does the general population feel about that form of government?
Okay, good. So it depends who you talk to in Saudi Arabia. If you're talking to political activists, they tell you it's okay with the monarchy, but we wanted a constitutional monarchy. If you talk to more radical political activists, they want absolutely, you know, they want the House of Saud family to be done and dispensed with once and for all. If you talk to social liberals who believe in slow change, they think, you know, it's not so much the regime type, it's more about, you know, the policies are enacted. The other thing is that I think because of the propaganda for many decades of the regime, some believe that, you know, it's okay to have a monarch. We see the House of Saud as like, you know, basically our family. It's our identity. There's like a lot of symbolism to it, and they look beyond it. So honestly, it really depends who you're talking to. Political activists, constitutional monarchy or a republic. Others, they'll probably be more open to an evolutionary change, like they call it. So.
Hi, yeah. I just had a question. So, Saudi Arabia has done a lot outside of the Middle East, trying to sway public and global opinion through investments in sporting and entertainment. We see it a lot with soccer, them, you know, bringing in all these really famous players on massive contracts this past year. And I was just wondering if you think that kind of Saudi Arabia has liberalized as much as they could, that the royal family has done as much as they're willing to do at this point, and so now they're shifting from a reform kind of approach to now a distraction kind of approach, trying to kind of, you know, have a coliseum and entertain the people, distracting them from what their actual atrocities and lack of reforms are.
That's a great question. That's a great question. There is definitely a bit of a distraction there for sure. Whenever there is like some domestic crisis, they try to shift their attention to these. But I think there is a limit to how much Saudi Arabia can distract, because when the Khashoggi crisis happened with the Saudi journalists in Turkey, they really tried to distract that. But now I think with open access with Saudis, a lot of Saudis actually were educated abroad. They read the Western media. I think there is a limit to that. But as far as the efforts made by the state to do that, there is absolutely some effort for sure. But now with open media, I think a lot of Saudis are sophisticated and they see that, you know, and they talk about it actually. It's like, we see what you're doing. So, yeah. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Mark. I'm currently studying legal studies here, and we've seen trends with other authoritarian regimes like China and Russia, where crackdown on the internet has become increasingly more and more important to them. Do you see Saudi Arabia trying to crack down on internet again, or where would you rate the level of freedom of expression in Saudi Arabian internet?
Okay, that's a great question. So initially, Saudi Arabia tried to block the internet. But like I said, it failed miserably because a lot of Saudis had been tapping into networks of the neighboring monarchies. So initially there was an attempt. And then I think there was a shift of attitude of the state. Instead of blocking the internet, let's embrace it. Now, Saudi Arabia is actually priding itself for being one of the best e-governance in the world, in terms of the utilization of the internet. So there is some cracking down, in some websites, but it varies. So they blocked FaceTime and then they put it back. They blocked Snapchat and they put it back. So there are definitely ways in which there are definitely some websites blocked in Saudi Arabia. But now, as the country is like trying to be more of an e-governance, it's trying, I think, to benefit from the internet at the same time to use it for like when Jamal Khashoggi was killed in the Saudi consulate in Turkey. Of course, he was tracked through his contacts. Of course, there is that use of the internet in that sense, but to outright, to the degree that China is doing, or Iran, not so much. And not because the state cannot, although even at the beginning it couldn't, but I think it sees values in other ways and trying to mitigate the effect of the internet using other methods. Yeah, spying and yeah.
Hello. Okay. My name is Jenna. I'm studying geospatial intelligence as well as international strategy and diplomacy. And so Saudi Arabia, from what I understand, has an exceptionally high population of migrant workers, especially from Southeast Asia. To what extent, with all of these economic and internet changes, to what extent are they able to influence Saudi Arabian politics? And is Saudi Arabia trying to welcome more of those types of workers, or are they emphasizing the cultivation of domestic labor?
That's a good question. From my reading and research, I would say, unfortunately, they don't have a lot of influence because their position in Saudi Arabia legally is very precarious. That, you can live in Saudi Arabia perpetually and you'll never have a citizenship, for example. And you have a contract that has to be renewed every short period of time. So a lot of them, they probably, try to stay away. And as somebody from Yemen, we have a lot of, Yemenis, like millions of Yemenis, who work inside Saudi Arabia, and they encounter the same calculus because of their precarious position legally, because if you say something, out. So a lot of them are not doing that, and they're only coming for economic reason, most of them, not, for example, education and other ways where you can say, so there is limited role for them politically, but hopefully, as now Saudi Arabia has introduced a citizenship program, it's still not clear, and permanent residency program, it's also not clear. Maybe that can change the precariousness of their legal position in the country, and that can, factor into their calculus when approaching domestic politics. It's risky for citizens, like let alone, others. But when it comes to social and cultural, I would say some of them probably would, especially if they speak the language, they will participate in these conversations, but not in a defiant way, and not with their actual identities exposed.
Sorry, one last question. As far as trying to follow what's going on in Saudi Arabia and wanting to look at that news and the switch from Arabic to English as a more popular language in that country, do you think there's accurate media representation of all political movements in both English and Arabic, or is the language used as a tool to reach certain populations?
Could you repeat that again?
So is the use of English versus Arabic, does that change which political groups use social media, and are they reaching different populations because there's kind of that switch from Arabic to English in political reform?
The younger generation, for sure, as many of them are educated abroad, and I think a subset of political activists they're actually more developing a discourse that appeals to the Western audience. So I think there is this awareness that Saudi Arabia is trying to cultivate this new image, and they're trying to affect that in some capacity, but definitely the younger generation. There is a switch. But at the same time, Saudis are very proud of Arabic and keeping it because they're Arabizing everything when it comes to tech. So there's, yeah.
Hi, my name is Ahmed Kharout, and I'm the Arabic Language Flagship Academy Coordinator, and I teach Arabic. What could we know about the influence of the Saudi Arabia in the field of media during the Arab fall or spring, I mean? And what could we know about the political, dirty, bloody Saudi money spread in the media in the Arab world to polish their image?
Thank you. So Saudi Arabia in the Middle East is known as like sort of the media empire when it comes to traditional media, like satellite media and print. So definitely they are, adopting a narrative that may not be favorable to the people living in these countries, like in the Arab Spring. Like when the Arab Spring took place in different parts of the region, of course they intervened in Bahrain. They tried not to effect change. They intervened in Yemen, the transition in Yemen. So there's definitely negative, because Saudi Arabia is very invested in its stability, and it does not want any change of the region, especially change of alliances. For example, if the Muslim Brothers or Bashar al-Assad stayed continued in Turkey, that would be on the Iran side, and Saudi Arabia tried to change that. So sadly, Saudi Arabia has its own interests, and trying to protect these interests that's destabilizing the region. But it's not the only actor in that, because sometimes it's a reaction, sometimes it's provoking for sure. It's destabilizing the region, unfortunately.
If there are no other questions, we'll just say thank you one more time. Please, a big round of applause for Safa.